Somewhere on a cracked concrete patio in Ohio, in a 5-gallon bucket nobody thought would work, a plant is quietly producing more food than half the raised garden beds in that same backyard. Most people will never know that's possible, because they were taught the wrong rule. They were taught that containers are where gardening goes to be limited. Today you're going to find out that for at least 9 plants, containers aren't the compromise. They're the upgrade. Before we get into it, if you've ever grown something in a pot and watched it struggle for reasons you couldn't explain, hit subscribe now, because by the end of this list you're going to understand exactly why that happened, and it probably wasn't your fault. Here's the problem almost nobody talks about. Most gardening advice was written for people with a 1/4 acre and a tiller. So when someone with a balcony or a small patio tries to follow that same advice in a pot, they're setting the plant up to fail before it even sprouts. Wrong container size. Wrong soil. A plant that was never built for pot life in the first place. And when the harvest disappoints, people blame themselves instead of the mismatch. That's about to change. Let's start with the potato, because this is where most people's assumptions get broken immediately. You'd think potatoes need a sprawling row of loose earth. They don't. What they actually need is darkness around the stem and room to keep expanding outward, and a fabric grow bag gives them exactly that. Here's the part almost nobody explains. As the plant grows taller, you keep burying more of the stem in soil, and every buried section of stem has the potential to grow more potatoes off of it. That's called hilling, and it's the entire secret. One properly hilled grow bag, under decent conditions, can realistically produce 10 to 15 pounds of potatoes by the end of the season. The mistake most beginners make is planting too deep at the start and never hilling again. Do that, and you'll get a handful of small potatoes instead of a harvest that fills a basket. Now here's where it gets genuinely surprising, because the next plant on this list breaks a rule that most gardening advice treats as gospel. Blueberries. Everyone assumes blueberries are hard to grow, and here's the real reason why. Blueberries need acidic soil, somewhere around a 4.5 to 5.5 pH, and most residential soil across the US sits closer to neutral or even alkaline. In the ground, correcting that is a slow, frustrating, years-long battle. In a container, you sidestep the entire problem, because you control the soil completely from day one. What looks like a limitation turns into the exact advantage that makes container blueberries easier than in-ground ones for most home gardeners. Then there's ginger, and this one might be the most underused plant in this entire list. A single knob from the grocery store, the kind sitting in your kitchen right now, can be broken into pieces, each with a visible eye, and planted shallow in a wide, low container. Over about 8 months in warm, humid, indirect light, that single piece can multiply into a pound or more of fresh ginger. Almost nobody grows this at home, not because it's difficult, but because nobody told them it was this simple. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If a plant this productive has been sitting in grocery store produce bins the whole time, what else have we been walking past without realizing it was garden ready? That brings us to the ground cherry, and if you've never heard of this one, you're not alone. It looks like a tiny golden tomato wrapped in a papery husk, almost like a miniature lantern, and the flavor is something between pineapple and vanilla. Most people assume it behaves like its cousin, the tomato, sprawling and demanding. It doesn't. Ground cherries keep a compact root system, which is exactly why they thrive in containers where a full-size tomato plant would struggle and choke itself out. Dwarf citrus is next, and this one challenges an assumption a lot of viewers in cooler states have probably made without even questioning it. Citrus feels like a warm climate-only plant, something for Florida or Southern California. But a dwarf lemon or lime tree grown in a large container can simply be moved indoors before the first frost hits. And here's the twist: experienced growers know that beginners usually don't. Keeping citrus in a container doesn't just make it portable. It actually keeps the tree smaller and easier to manage than the same variety would ever be planted in the ground. Now, bush beans versus pole beans. This is the mistake that quietly ruins more container gardens than almost anything else on this list. Pole beans need serious vertical support and long, deep root runs, and when someone plants them in a small pot expecting a compact harvest, the plant fights the container the entire season. Bush beans were bred differently. They stay low, compact, and self-supporting, which makes them almost perfectly matched to container life. If your beans have ever felt like a losing battle, there's a real chance you were simply growing the wrong type for the space you had. Strawberries come next, and here's the part that surprises even people who've grown them before. In the ground, strawberry plants send out runners that spread aggressively, competing with the original plant for nutrients and water. That competition is part of why in-ground strawberry patches often produce smaller berries over time. In a vertical container, those runners have nowhere to steal resources from. With nothing to compete against, the original plant redirects more of its energy straight into fruit production instead of spreading itself thin. Hot peppers might be the most counterintuitive plant on this entire list. Most vegetables respond to stress by struggling. Peppers do the opposite. When a pepper plant becomes slightly root-bound, that mild stress actually signals the plant to shift its energy away from leaf growth and toward fruit production. It's one of the rare cases in gardening where a little bit of restriction produces a better outcome than more room would. And finally, the plant that even experienced growers tend to forget about. The bay laurel tree. A single bay laurel, grown in a container, can live for decades, quietly producing fresh bay leaves year after year. If you've only ever cooked with the dried, dusty leaves from a spice jar, fresh bay leaf is barely recognizable by comparison, and most people never realize the plant behind it is something they could be growing on their own patio for the rest of their life. So what actually connects all 9 of these? It's not luck, and it's not a green thumb you either have or don't. Every single one of these plants has a natural growth habit that happens to match the limitations of a container instead of fighting against them. Potatoes want darkness and vertical buildup. Blueberries want controlled soil. Peppers want a little restriction. Containers don't hold these plants back. For each one, the container is doing exactly what the plant needed all along. If you've struggled with container gardening before, there's a good chance the plant was simply never suited to pot life in the first place, and no amount of extra care was going to fix that mismatch. So here's what I'd actually do. Don't try all 9 at once. Pick 1, maybe 2. A grow bag of potatoes. A pot of bush beans. Something small enough to watch closely this season. Pay attention to how differently it responds compared to whatever struggled in a container before. Results will still depend on your sunlight, your climate, your USDA hardiness zone, and how consistent your care is, but the odds shift dramatically in your favor the moment you're working with the plant's nature instead of against it. Here's a question worth asking yourself before the next growing season starts. Which of these 9 have you walked past in a grocery store or a garden center without ever realizing it was container ready the whole time? Once you understand which plants actually want to live in a pot, a small patio stops being a limitation. It starts becoming one of the most productive growing spaces you own. And there's one more mistake, one that has nothing to do with which plant you choose and everything to do with the size of the container itself, that quietly ruins more harvests than every mismatch on this list combined. That's exactly what we're uncovering next.